term and long term between the two, and also with Vygotsky. I was listening to some people at work today talking about classroom equity. I think that's what it's called. Does that like tie into that at all? Like, is that where that is sourced from?
Can you ask that question again? Because I realized I was not recording this session and I had to turn on my recorder. So ask that question again.
One, between the two guys, who do you think was the most influential over like classroom education, short term and long term? Like, I don't know.
At first, Piaget. Piaget was very popular in the United States in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s. And let me tell you, if any of you ever heard of the open classroom concept? So schools were, because of Piaget's theory, they were building what were called open classrooms. So you would walk into a school and there's really no walls.
Yes, I had a school that had like 3 classes in a thing like that.
Yeah, and the theory was you create an enriching environment and the children are working. They're working in different stations and the teachers are facilitating and walking around and taking notes and watching how children learn. And then as the children are learning, they'll put out new things for the children to do. There's some teaching going on, but most of it was creating this environment where children were learning. So the outdoor education movement, that's also based on Piaget. Now, Vygotsky wouldn't say that that's wrong, right? But Vygotsky would say we need to push students a little bit further, right? That they can learn at a faster pace than, say, Piaget would think that they could learn. Now, somewhat of Piaget's research that he did, it was limiting in the way that he asked questions. So there is some criticism about Piaget's theories based on the research he collected and the way he asked questions. And some people will say that his questions limited what children were able to do. And I have a video that's really good about Piaget, but it's on a VHS tape and I can't get it. Nobody can transfer it to download it for me, but I'll try when I go in next week. So I would say, so this is going to date me. So I wrote my dissertation in 1996 and 1997.
Hey, that's when I was born.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry.
So at that time,
sorry.
And I was at UVA, that's all right. I was at UVA. I was one of the only people in the United States studying Vygotsky because his stuff had just been released in the late 60s and 70s to the United States, and it had to all be translated. So when I worked on my dissertation, there was not one faculty member at the University of Virginia who knew anything about Vygotsky. So when I went in and I was talking to my advisors about my work, basically I had to teach them all about Vygotsky. They knew about Piaget. So I would do a compare and contrast. Okay, so this is what Piaget says, this is what Vygotsky says. And so to educate people on Vygotsky's theory, I had to compare him to Piaget because they knew Piaget. So half of my like a quarter of the first part of my dissertation is Piaget, and then comparing Piaget to Vygotsky, and then getting into the data collection when I moved away from Piaget and moved just totally onto Vygotsky. So now, if we take a look at some of the new researchers, if we take a look at Angela Duckworth, who's working with grit, if we take a look at Carol Dweck, who's working with mindset, and Howard Gardner, who's working with multiple intelligences, they're moving a little bit more toward, well, they're more Vygotsky than they are Piaget, because it's more about interacting in the classrooms and setting your own goals and meeting those goals. So setting goals as you move along up the educational ladder, I guess you could call it. But also this culturally responsive teaching is definitely Vygotsky, right? You might want to look up the Freedom Schools. So the Freedom School movement, which was started in the 60s with the civil rights movement. The freedom schools are schools for mostly African American children to have a place to learn when the public schools were closed, right? So communities would just close their schools rather than integrate. And so a lot of the Black leaders started what was called the freedom schools. And the freedom schools are definitely built on Vygotsky's theory. Because it's all about communication and interaction and collaboration and bringing your culture into the classroom to learn.
So it integrates what's familiar in order to help you learn?
Yeah, yes, that's exactly it. And that piece of what's familiar, and not just what's familiar, but also your cultural background, right? We all have different cultural backgrounds. If we grew up on a farm versus if we grew up in Manhattan, those are different cultures. And so you have to take into account some of the cultural differences when you are teaching children from those particular areas. So for example, I moved here from the north. So I get a job to teach in Lynchburg. I'm used to culture in the north. There's a difference between the culture in the north and the culture in the south. So sometimes when I would say to children, like if they were misbehaving, right, and I was talking to them, the children would look down and I would say, look me in the eyes when I'm talking to you. But that's a sign of disrespect. So I had to learn that to look an adult in the eyes when you did something wrong here was a sign of disrespect, where up north, putting your head down was a sign of disrespect. So that's a cultural difference, right? And then there's a lot of like very the different cultures, and it could be a regional culture, it could be a religious culture, it could be an ethnicity cultural difference. But teachers, the more you develop these cultural connections with children and these relationships, the more successful you'll be in the classroom. And so a lot of the new research and a lot of the new researchers are really honing in on that particular concept, the culturally relevant teaching.
It's going to be hard to integrate like every culture imaginable into schools, especially in like inner city schools, because there's like 12 different cultures on one block.
Well, it's not that the teacher has to integrate every single culture, it's that the teacher needs to be sensitive to
and aware and open-minded to it.
Yeah, and just to be aware of it, right? So for instance, we were talking at dinner the other night about a standardized test that they give children. And my son was watching something on TV, and they were talking about these tests. And in this one example that they were given, the children were converting, like in the metric system, millimeters, grams, kilograms, okay? And the example given on the test, what would be measured, what would be weighed in grams? And they
kilograms, grams.
And they use like a elephant, a dog, a cat, or a parakeet. Well, this teacher said he was teaching in an inner city. The children all got it wrong because they didn't know what a parakeet was. If they had used the word bird, they would have gotten it right. But because they used the word parakeet and they didn't, that's an example of culturally relevant. So if the test, the people who developed the test understood that those children in that school in the Bronx didn't know what a parakeet was, they would have used the word bird instead, and the children would have gotten it correct. So those are just a couple of examples. Does that help?
So it should have been like more broad to like try to like integrate as many cultures as possible, or? Well,
it's called testing bias. So you have to be really careful about, and sometimes, okay, what we have to understand that you included, we are where we are because we knew how to do something called school. We knew how to do school, right? It was familiar to us. The questions that the teachers asked were familiar. We were successful because we understood school culture. We knew what we were supposed to do in that environment, right? So that if there was a question on a standardized test about sailboats, right? Even if I had never been sailing, probably I knew what a sailboat was, right? Now, there are some children who have no idea what you're talking about because they don't have the experiences, and they tend then not to be able to do school well. Because when we bring up these examples, this happened to me when I was teaching 5th grade in Lynchburg City Schools. So I was teaching 5th grade, and they were getting ready for the end of the year tests. And somebody from the administration came into my classroom, and he had this big box. And in this box were containers and lima beans and all this stuff for the children to grow lima beans. And I'm like, this is the weirdest thing. Why is it all of a sudden they want me to do, out of the blue, an experiment with these children on how to grow lima beans and what happens and how, measuring and observing and all of that. And I'm like, all right, I'll teach them how to grow lima beans. Now, these are children at Darrington Elementary School, which is a small neighborhood school. I taught there forever. It's a great school, but it's next to housing, subsidized housing projects. We come to the end of the year test. Guess what? There was a reading passage. Guess what the reading passage was on?
Lima beans.
Lima beans. I'm like, huh. So that's why they had me grow lima beans, because they knew that the children who typically children who live in poverty, they didn't have those experiences. Let's give them the experience. Okay, that was not really the best ethical move to make, right? They knew what was on that test, and that's why they wanted those children to grow the lima beans. But that would be an example, right? Because they knew that the children were going to read that passage, have no idea what they're talking about, and not do well on that reading passage because they didn't have the background information.
Where's the, there it is.
Okay?
So,
Does that help?
yeah, I've noticed though that I'm sorry, what
Piaget?
Piaget. I noticed that when it comes to like K through 12, like Vygotsky was probably more effective, but for like very early learning, like object permanence and speech, it seems like Piaget may still be pretty relevant in those, because it's hard to communicate with a kid to push them forward in an environment where they literally are all on their own for trying to figure it out for themselves. Like
and yes, and Vygotsky would say that a lot of Piaget's theory is correct, but the pieces he was missing was that little bit of scaffolding, probing students, and he also was missing the culture piece and the importance of speech. So here's another distinguishing difference between Piaget and Vygotsky. So you're listening to 3-year-olds. Say they're building with blocks, okay? And one child's building, and next to him, another child's building, right? They're not talking to each other. They're not playing together, right? They're just building next to each other. That's called parallel play. So they're engaged in parallel play. They're not interacting with each other. There's no cooperative play going on. But then the child starts talking, right? So I'm the child, I'm one of the children, and I say, I need a bigger block. I'm going to take this block and I'm going to put it over here. And this is going to be my road. Okay. And then I'm going to take this block and put it on top. So let's just say I'm grabbing stuff off my dining room table. So let's just say I'm going to put it on top here. And oh, that doesn't work. I'll have to try something else. So now that is an example. I'm not talking to the other child. I'm not talking to anybody. I'm just talking out loud. Now Piaget would say,
Using verbal reasoning.
Kind of, but Piaget would say, ignore that talk. It's egocentric talk. It really is meaningless. It does not have any role in how a child develops language or learning or how to get along with others. Now, Vygotsky would say, you're absolutely wrong, Piaget. That talk is called, when we talk about that talk in connection with Piaget or Vygotsky also called it egocentric speech. Piaget coined the term egocentric speech, but Vygotsky used the same term. But researchers now will use the term private speech when we're talking about what Vygotsky was talking about. Vygotsky would say that private speech, that egocentric speech, is key to self-regulation. So what the child is doing is the child is teaching themselves by verbalizing everything that they do. And he said that never goes away your whole life. What happens is that speech becomes internalized because we pick up on social cues that it's really not very appropriate to be walking down the street and talking out loud to myself all the time, right? But think about that. My good example is a little outdated because you're all now pretty computer savvy. But I used to say to students years ago, when we would go into the computer lab, right? What do students do when the computer doesn't work?
Talk to it and smack it.
Talk to it. You're talking to a computer. You're engaged in private speech. You know the computer's not talking back to you, right? You know the computer, and I do it all the time. Oh my gosh, this computer's, you're being really slow, right? That is my private speech coming out because of my frustration. So I'm using that private speech to try to figure out how to get this computer to come back on. And Vygotsky says that you do that all the time. It's called self-regulatory learning.
I think I have an. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I think I have an idea what you're talking about because I talk to myself a lot, probably more than is the healthy amount. But I have a. Oh, by the way, did you talk to?
I did, and I got all the paperwork.
Okay, sorry.
Yep.
Because I can't type or write very well, I learned to speak on my iPad, and so
Mm-hmm.
I have a tendency to verbalize most of my thoughts just to organize them, just to put more context and just
Mm-hmm.
make them into actual coherent sentences.
Right. Yeah, and that speech helps you learn, and you shouldn't stop it. Now, you'll have children in the classroom that are like that, and when we tell children to be quiet, sometimes we are doing them a misservice, right? So, do you use Dragon software?
No, with most iPads, you can just the voice dictation thing.
Just the voice to text, which is really nice for students now. My son has the same thing. He had a Scribe.
I
all the
remember
way through
having
high
a Scribe.
school. What?
I remember having a Scribe. I
Yeah.
talked way too fast, and she like slow down for like 2 seconds. I need to catch up.
Yeah. So he had a Scribe because of that, right? That the processing or the writing was so difficult. But that speech is important to your learning. If somebody made you stop that speech, your learning would decrease. And Vygotsky would say that is, you're self-regulating your learning, and that's really important.
Okay.
Yeah,
So,
and Piaget really doesn't recognize it at all. And that's what my whole dissertation was about. I videotaped children working, and I coded their speech. And the more they talked, the more they learned.
What age group did you focus on?
I collected my data over 2 years at it was a blended kindergarten, first grade classroom. So they were for kindergarten, half of them were kindergartners, half of them were first graders. So yeah, it was very interesting. Now, later on, I did another research study at a local elementary school with fifth graders. And I was looking at gender differences in working together on a task. And I used Vygotsky's theory again and coded. So I videotaped them working, we coded all of their speech, and then we looked at their products, their end products. But we were looking at the interactions between girls. So we had two dyads, so pairs of students. So we had girl-girl dyads, so two girls. We had boy-girl dyads, and we had boy-boy dyads. And then we videotaped them, we transcribed all the tapes, and we looked at their type of speech, right? So on-task speech, off-task speech, giving directions, asking questions. And so when we coded that, we found something very interesting. And then we took that what they were doing is they were writing a newspaper. They were creating a newspaper. And then we had a rubric and we scored the newspapers. So what dyad pair, what dyad combination do you think performed the best?
Mixed.
Boy, girl.
Boy, girl?
Boy, girl. I mean,
Who do you think had the most off-task talk?
Boy, boy.
Girls.
Boy.
Depends on what you mean. Do you mean more talking or more throwing things?
No, I'm talking about on-task talk. So on-task talk is who was talking about what they were working on the most.
Oh. I thought you meant distraction. I was like,
well, off-task talk would be distractions.
Yeah.
Right? So you're talking about the birthday party coming up this weekend. You know,
or which superhero you like best, or
right, that's off-task.
No, yeah, I don't know.
I would say the two boys probably talk the most on task.
Why would you say that?
I feel like they just are more direct and kind of getting to things. And the two girls would tend to talk more off task.
Okay, so you're correct. The boys had the most on-task talk. The girls had the most off-task talk. However, the girls' newspapers scored significantly higher than the boys. And the
boys don't communicate with each other.
And the girls probably elaborated more.
The girls, when they were working, right, and this is where Vygotsky's theory it was a beautiful example of Vygotsky's theory. When the girls were working, they would work and they talk. They could multitask beautifully. And they would say, okay, what kind of font? And they would say, we need, a colored font this size. We need, 14-point font. This is the title, so it needs to be bigger. Okay, so what are you wearing to the party? Well, one's typing the font into the newspaper article, right? The boys, on the other hand, when they're talking about the font, they would talk about font size for 15 to 20 minutes. And they would get stuck on the font size, and so their newspaper never really was fully developed. They were talking about the newspaper the whole time, but what they were talking about was not, it was on task, but it was they got so stuck on the minutia, where the female pairs they didn't get stuck on the minutia. They were multitasking, they were getting the job done, they were writing their articles, and talking about what was happening the whole time. Now, the boy-girl pair, they were second. They had the second highest score on the newspaper rubric, and their off-task talk was probably the least of all. So it was a really interesting study to kind of try to capture the importance of talk, and if talk is on-task talk or off-task talk, because teachers, when you're teaching children how to work in groups, right, you want to make sure that they're talking about what they're supposed to be working on. However, we learned that might not be the case with females in the classroom. If there's a whole group of females working together, they might not necessarily need to be talking strictly about the task at all times. They tend to go off task a lot, but still perform much better.
So, since the mixed group had the least amount of off-topic, the least amount of off-topic conversation, does that mean that did they have the least amount of conversation? Period.
They did have the least amount of conversation. Yes, good assumption.
So does that mean that just keeping conversation on topic can be more harmful than no conversation at all?
Not necessarily. Of course, we wanted to continue the research because we had, I think, 26 children. So it was a small sample size, right? But we had a lot of data. it really, at that age, right, because we had to take into consideration development. So the boy-girl pairs, and we paired them together randomly. Sometimes they were uncomfortable with each other, right? They're fifth graders. And boys and girls in fifth grade, you know, they're moving into adolescence and they're starting that whole boy-girl, does she like me, does he like me kind of thing. So we had to take that into consideration. We think that that interfered with some of the conversations in that particular situation.
So what would happen then if you were to pick maybe like 10th graders where they're just beyond that phase, but they're still not very old? Do you think the results would have changed much?
I think we would find the same with the female groups. I think females can multitask better, right? And that pans out in studies done in the workplace, right? That females just tend to multitask much better, right? Think about working parents, right? Working mothers, the tasks that they tend to juggle both in the home with kids and full-time work is a little bit more than often their male partner is juggling at the same time. And we can't separate that. Here comes that cultural thing again, right? It's a cultural norm in our society that is changing slowly over time, but the cultural norm still is pretty seeped in females are caregivers, right? So we're moving away from that pretty strongly, as are some other countries. We were just talking about this at dinner tonight. In Japan, the females have put their foot down and said, no, I'm not getting married, because if I get married, I'm expected to not only take care of my husband, I'm expected to take care of my husband's mother and my husband's extended family and the children. And so the women in Japan are deciding not to marry. And that's a changing cultural norm in that particular society. We're kind of getting off track here, but the whole point is the importance of taking a look at culture and how culture influences the way that we learn in the classroom. And Vygotsky really stressed how important teachers needed to understand the children's background that they were teaching and build relationships with those children to help them push them in learning in the right directions.
Right.
Other questions?
For maybe this was just a misread on my part, but looking at chapter 2 it started talking about behaviorism and like behaviorism in the classroom. Is that strictly categorized by respondent and operant conditioning, or does that go beyond it? Because I kind of was confused going into the topic, and then I was like, okay, this stuff makes sense, but is that necessarily behaviorism? And then
right.
So I was just
I do have to say up front, I'm not a behaviorist. Okay,
so that's a different thing altogether.
Constructivist. So behaviorism is not my forte because I really don't believe in behaviorism. But behaviorism in the classroom really has to do more with reinforcement. Okay, you rarely see now when you're working with severely intellectually disabled children, you will get closer to maybe some some conditioning types of aspect, right? So it might be operant conditioning more, but what you're going to see in the classroom is more positive reinforcement. So when a child, and you'll get, if you finish your work, you'll get a sticker. Okay. So they'll use that, or they'll sometimes use the Premack principle, which is sometimes called Grandma's rule, right? Eat your dinner and you'll get dessert. Do your homework and you'll get recess. Okay, that would be an example of that Premack principle. Token economies, right? Children earn tokens and then they have these tokens and they can turn them in for a prize. So that's positive reinforcement. I'm getting the token, I take my tokens and I get a prize. So negative reinforcement is putting your name up on the board. So I did something wrong, my name goes up on the board. I'm totally against any kind of public, I call it public humiliation at all
That's
costs.
what it is.
So you should never put a child's name up. You should never have a red light, green light, yellow light in a classroom for a couple of reasons. Not only is it humiliating, but it is also a violation of FERPA, the Family's Educational Rights Protective Act, right?
Random question: how old is that rule?
FERPA?
I remember. Yeah,
Probably
or
80s?
I remember the green light, yellow light, red
Yes.
light thing.
FERPA has been into play since, oh gosh, forever.
80?
Oh yeah. FERPA was in place when I was in college. I'd have to go look up the dates, but most teachers don't know they're in violation of FERPA. And a lot of this is just coming out now because a lot of
They're still dealing with that stupid shit by incompetent teachers.
Do you know the, what do they call them? Dojos? So they're these, so a teacher has her phone and you set up this, it's a positive reinforcement, well, it's also a negative reinforcer too, but if you get points for doing what you're supposed to be doing and the teacher has it on her phone and you'll hear this little blip and so the children know somebody got a dojo point. Well, the company,
That's horrible.
the company that has this, all the information from that the teacher has goes directly to the company. So there have been some complaints that that's a violation of FERPA because your parents don't know the information is going to the company. But those kind
so bad.
behaviorism works in schools, right? I see less and less of it happening in schools because I think that principals are now becoming more familiar with the culture responsive classroom. They're becoming more familiar with if we build relationships with children and if children are active learners, they're not going to misbehave in classrooms. You're going to have that rare case where a child's going to misbehave, but your day-to-day kinds of misbehaviors, you don't need those types of behaviorist charts. Now, I will say when I started teaching at 5th grade at Darrington, I started in January and the children ruled the classroom. And so I did use behavior modification to get them back into a classroom setting where they understood that they could not do some of these things. And that was behavior modification. They did something correct. They had a little chart on their desk. They got a sticker on their chart. When they got so many stickers, they got to go to the prize box. So you can use behavior modification in the classroom, but the whole goal is to wean children off the need for that, right? Because you're not always going to be there to reward their behavior. You want them to behave even if you're not there, right? So those types of conditioning are pretty common in classrooms, but I see them decreasing.
We had kind of like it wasn't like a red light, green light, but it was like it was 4 cards, green, yellow, red, and blue. Blue meant that they were calling your parents, letting you know that you got one. And,
but the whole class knew that, right?
Yeah, the whole class knew, and basically, I was probably one of the best students, but I got called probably more than anyone because I kept forgetting about where I was and just kept talking because I'm not going to get into my baggage, but the point is I felt horrible every single time. I felt like I messed up and just stuff like that. And I can definitely see why that's
it does have a long-lasting negative influence on children long-term. So
it really seems like you're punishing them for doing what kids just naturally do. Like they talk, they sometimes interrupt the teacher because they have something that they want to say right now and they're going to forget about it, so they got to say it right now.
Right. Yes. And that's understanding development. So when you that's understanding the stages of development, and that's why I always have students read the stages of development, because that's good information. I'm not saying Piaget's wrong and totally wrong. He has some really good things, and his stages do give us an idea of where we should expect particular things in children. What we have to understand is there are so many individual differences, and culture and socialization play such a key role. We have to take Piaget and kind of blend them together. So that's why I have you do that compare and contrast activity, so you can see the strengths of both, where they come together, and where they differ.
So, excuse me, one more question then again about that. And you may have already said it and I may have missed it. But so behaviorism gets tricky because as the child ages, it gets more and more difficult to reward the child. So how does constructivism like address that? Is that sort of like a, hey, we're going to make education fun, like, maybe we're going to do this really cool science lab, instead of talking about a nice graph of like a plant and like learning the parts, we're going to actually have our own little like lima bean plants or whatnot? Is like that kind of the approach?
Well, you get close, but constructivism, the whole premise of constructivism is that people, children, you, me, we all construct our own knowledge based on our experiences and based on our environment. So we have to have opportunities in school to construct our own knowledge, or it's not going to stick, right? We've all taken those classes where we crammed, we got an A on the test, and 2 weeks later, we probably couldn't answer a question right.
I couldn't answer the question right tomorrow.
Yeah. So what constructivism, the whole premise is to get students engaged in the material so that they will remember the material long term. Now, how do you do that? A lot of that is done because based on that the student must be active in the classroom. You cannot be a passive learner. We're not very good at that right now in the United States. We do a lot of
Talking at the students.
Talking at the students, correct. Now, one of the things that I'm curious about is these online classes. Do students learn more if they're given more freedom and they're reading the information and then they're going in and asking questions, or not, right? I'm very curious to see, because this is my first time teaching a totally purely online class. How do students do in this type of class? How do students like this type of class?
I'm not a huge fan. I mean, I haven't taken that many online courses, but maybe I just need a little bit more structure, because sometimes it's hard to motivate myself. I mean, I always get it done on time, but sometimes it's just by the skin of my teeth, and
right.
Maybe I just need more structure. It could just be my problem, but
and that's why I put those little boxes next to each day so that you can go and check off as you're doing things.
Thank you very much for those.
Sometimes that helps you just see a visual. Okay, I've completed that. Oh, I have a blank box. I better go check. Did I really do that? It kind of helps you stay on track.
Actually, already this class has been more helpful than some of the other online courses I've taken before, simply because we are doing Zoom lecture or Zoom office hour.
Right.
So there's still talking and interaction. Like, I actually see your face and I know what your voice sounds like.
Right.
I've taken online courses before where you can take the course for 6 months and you won't meet the instructor, and that almost makes it more difficult when you get towards the end of the second half of the course. So thank you very much for doing this.
Well, good. I'm glad it's working.
Extremely helpful.
I did buy the extended package, so we're not limited. As you noticed, we didn't get a warning. You're going over your 40 minutes, because I thought, based on the last one, I said, we're never going to stick to under 40 minutes. So we don't have to worry about time constraints.
Thank you.
Any other questions I can address tonight?
Haley, our list.
Our list?
Our list.
Oh, our list.
What list?
Raina and I were Skyping each other while we were working.
For several hours.
Good.
I only had one thing written down, and that was we were wondering how long you were planning for each assignment to take. So like, for example, how long do you think it should take us to read the chapters? Because Rena and I took a while to read the first 2 chapters.
As in, I'm not completely done reading chapter 2, and I have almost 6 pages back in front of notes.
You're probably taking too many notes.
That's
Right.
what we also were summing up
Yeah.
from that too.
Yeah. So, yeah, you shouldn't be taking 12 pages of notes. So when you're reading the chapters, right, read them through and then go back through, and you can highlight right in the text. Highlight some key points, okay? Tab some key points, because remember, the midterm and the final are open book, right? I'm not expecting you to memorize this information. Okay? But you want to know where to be able to go find the information if you've read the chapter, if you've highlighted some things, if you tabbed, oh, this is an important point. Or, gee, she has us read about Vygotsky, she had us read about Piaget, we watched a video on Vygotsky and Piaget, and we had an assignment on Vygotsky and Piaget. She's probably going to ask something on Piaget and Vygotsky. Right. So you can take cues from that. I don't really believe in doing a lot of memorization of information. I want you to be able to have read it and be able to go back and quickly find the information because you're familiar with it.
Like, read it, understand it, but don't worry about memorizing all the information.
Don't memorize. You can't memorize all the information. You just have to keep working with it, right? I can spew off things about Vygotsky and Piaget because I've been doing it for 20 years. I should be pretty good about it, right? I wrote a dissertation on him. I've done multiple research projects. So it sounds like it's coming really quickly, but hey, I've studied it for 20 years, so I should know it by now, right? So
my method for taking notes, and this is honest, I just copy and paste the chapter summary. That's really all I need. Like,
for your notes.
Yeah, that was my plan for chapter 3.
And Jackson, you probably have because my son does the same thing. He reads something, and his strategies are more internal, right? So when you read something or you hear something, you are processing that information a little bit differently than somebody who has to write notes.
Well,
right?
I do sometimes take notes for higher stuff. Ultimately, I mostly just take notes so I can better internalize things.
Good.
Just like sometimes hearing it and writing it just gives me a broader picture, usually for just like math and physics and stuff like that. But yeah, I don't study that much, which sounds like a really bad strategy, but
if your brain doesn't need it, it doesn't need it.
It's just looking at words on a page that I already know, and it's boring, and sometimes I do need it, but ultimately I've already retained most of the stuff that I just go through it once in class. I'm talking about myself way too much.
No,
I'm sorry.
See, these are the things that when you're working with any population, whether you're going to be a teacher or whatever profession you go in, if you know people and you know how they learn and how they work, then we don't make assumptions. Like, for instance, I argue with faculty on campus all the time that don't ban computers from your classrooms and require students to take notes, because there was a study done that says taking notes, students do better when they handwrite notes. I'm like, well, some students, not all students. So if you have a student and you know that this student, Jackson, he's paying attention to you, but he's not taking notes, or he's not taking a lot of notes, it doesn't mean he's not learning the information, because I know already, I've talked to him, that's how he learns the information. So I'm not going to count it against him, right? So that's that culturally responsive teaching. So I'm not going to overgeneralize for the whole class, because there are faculty on campus who ban computers in their classrooms, and I don't agree with that. So I think you have to know what your students are doing and how they learn. And if you do know that, then you're going to understand how they're studying and how you can help them better learn the information from their strength point, I guess I want to say.
And having a dialogue with students is really important too, with trying to figure out how best you can help modify the class or how best they can help modify the class themselves to make it the most successful that it can be.
Right. Exactly. So yes, if you're taking 12 pages of notes, you're taking too many notes. Okay? So, but you'll probably know the information, but develop maybe a different strategy. What are the key points I want to know here? Right? What are the things she's talked about or given us assignments on? If I gave you an assignment on it, now not every video I have given you is going to be written about in the textbook. Okay? The videos and the assignments I've given you are key things that I think are important for you to understand about educational psychology and classroom management. I have never found a textbook that I totally rely on. So I kind of end up designing my own textbook per se through the assignments I give.
Which is actually kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And like just helps as a general thing because it gives the different kind of things for the different learners, like the visual learners or get the videos and the auditory learners get the dialogue from all the videos. And then the people like me who kind of learn from reading, writing, and then kind of verbalizing a little bit.
Yeah.
Get everything kind of.
Right. And we all learn, and we have strengths in certain modalities, but we use all modalities to learn. All right. Okay, so if you want to chat again for another office hour, let me know, but otherwise we'll be on next Wednesday. Oh, I'm driving home on Wednesday. I should be home by 8 o'clock. I'll just make sure I'm home by 8 o'clock. I'm going to New York, so I'll be home by 8 o'clock.
Have fun in New York.
I'm going to upstate New York. I'm going to visit my parents. So they're in upstate New York, and my sister, who lives in Texas, is there. So we're taking a short trip up and coming back. So it's not the city. It's way upstate.
That's fine. It's beautiful up there.
It is pretty up there, yeah. All right, so like I said, email me if you have any questions about assignments. If something's unclear, please email me. We can either converse via email or I can set up another Zoom conversation with you. Okay?
Thank you very much.
All right. Good night.
Good night.
We'll talk soon.
All right.